How's everyone? Yeah, we got some summer this week, didn't we? Yeah, it was good, and then spring came back. Let's just keep the snow. Let's just keep the snow away. I'd be really content not to have winter going. So this morning we begin a new book. Now, if you're new to One Place, you're visiting here for the first time, a key part of our liturgy and worship identity is that we work our way through different books of the Bible. And sometimes we cover a chapter, sometimes we go over 4 or 5 chapters depending on the book. But we just, through the year, we work our way through different books. We just finished the book of Judges, and now we're going into a book of judgment called Daniel. Perhaps you're familiar with the book of Daniel. Now, I had a friend that I was visiting with last night, and I'm not sure that I see him here. William, are you here? Where are you at, bud? Yeah, somewhere in the back. Oh, William, you're not shy. Come on down, bud. Come on down. I mean, if you consent, are you okay to come on down? Yeah, you're good. I probably need a mic for him. Will you bring me there, that? So William doesn't know that I've asked him to do this because while I talked with him last night, I still wasn't sure if I was going to have him come up. William, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm William. I did not expect that I'd be coming up here today.
Yeah. We'll give Mom and Dad time to get the video camera out. So, William, I asked you a few different questions, and one of the things that I asked you to do, and maybe you can remember or make it up right now, either way is good with me. Mm-hmm. When you think about Daniel chapter 1, what comes to mind?
So for me, in the very beginning of Daniel chapter 1, we have Daniel and his friends taken from Israel into a whole new setting. They don't know where they are, what they're doing, and right off the bat, they're kind of all alone, and they only have each other and the people that they were brought with into this pagan land with people who want them to do things that they're not so sure of, like many of you might have heard of the story of the meat and wine that the people wanted them to eat and drink because they said it was only the most fit for the king's advisors. And they refused to eat it, and they chose to do vegetables and water instead, even though everyone around them was falling to the ways of the people around them saying, you should do this, you should do that.
So when you read this story and you thought about Daniel and his friends and everything that's happening there in chapter 1, how does that connect with your life now?
So for me, when I was reading through it and when we were talking about it yesterday, it kind of clicked in my head that everybody here nowadays has those people in their lives that will try to get them to do one or another thing, whether it may be good or bad. And we have our own battles inside our hearts, whether we're going to be the people who had the wine, had the meat, or whether we're going to be the ones to say, no, I'm going to do the water and the vegetables, and I'm not going to fall to what other people want me to do.
Well, great. Now I'm going to ask you a really difficult question because I thought your response to this last night showed a great level of maturity. So I hope that since this is completely not rehearsed, you answer it in the same way. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm going to have to find another way to go with your response. But is there anything actually wrong with like eating meat and stuff like? Was there actually anything wrong with that? Was that like a moral no-no, right? The eating and drinking.
So for them, I do think that they knew it was unhealthy and that these foods were bad for them.
So when you were talking about some of your friends, like, well, people that you know.
Yeah.
For the purposes of the parental units, they're not your friends, but they're people that you know. Right.
So I had met people at one time or another, and they had vaped, and when I hung around them, they would do it quite a fair amount, which when I saw them do it, even though I already know the disadvantages of it, that when I saw it, I just was kind of sad for them almost, because you can see the hold that it has on them and the block it has almost. Because when I talked to him about it and I said, why do you do it? He honestly told me that he got addicted to it when he was younger and he couldn't stop it, and he even said he hated it.
So you saw this and you're like, yeah, your heart was touched, but you also made a very clear decision, Mom and Dad, not to vape.
Yeah.
This is what he told me in private, so I know it's true. Yeah, not to vape,
Yeah.
which is really, really solid. So like right away, you're reading the story and you're realizing, man, this has application for me in my life right now. And the thing that I really enjoyed that you shared, William, is how when you saw other people doing this thing that kind of had them caught, right, like caught up, that it made your heart sad for them. And I just kind of imagine that when God looks at us caught up in things that are less than healthy, right, that his heart is sad for us too, probably because you know that there could be a better way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dude, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Let's give William a hand for this impromptu sermon. Pretty good for an 8th grader, huh? Yeah, he graduates next week, and we're very excited about him graduating. So the reason I wanted to pick on William's perspective of Daniel chapter 1 is because he's grown up like an Adventist education. He's probably read some Sabbath school materials, and is a good reflection that if you've grown up within our tradition, some of the things that we see here and understand about the book of Daniel. And I would say that he has a really good grasp of chapter 1 and some of the elements that are really important to note there. So why am I getting into all of that? Because one of the things about Daniel that is really, really powerful is how complete the book of Daniel is as it relates to God and the human experience. Okay? One of the challenges that we face if you grow up with a religious identity that's deeply connected to like prophecy. All right, anybody here have that? You know, you grew up with a religious tradition that was really kind of tied with prophecy, is that even when you accept the historical lens of prophecy, this idea of prophecy seems like something that is other human, right? Something that's extracted outside of the human experience. And we kind of live in this alienated reality that there's prophecy, it's what's happening there, and we're not quite sure or certain how it impacts and connects and intertwines with my unique story, right? It's the kind of thing, here's one of the like small ways that it manifests. When we think about the end of time, probably if you've grown up in this tradition, you think about Christians being persecuted, right? Anybody here? Yeah, you think about Christians being persecuted. Now, did you know that for all of history, Christians have always been persecuted somewhere? Right? Somewhere on the globe, at every period in time, Christians have been persecuted. But because your experience is so far removed from that Christian's experience, your prophetic lens says this is something that's far, far away. But if we really, and here's the invitation of Daniel, and Daniel chapter 1 sets us up perfectly to understand this, that what is in this book is authenticated in our human experience. It's not something set apart from us. It's not something that's happening in the super future or in the super past. But it is something that we can understand. It's something that we can live, and it's something that we experience, each one of us, right now, right in this moment. So I kind of just want to set the table in a broad sense for Daniel, because we're going to be in this book for like the next 12 or 13 weeks, like a good part of the summer. I think there's a couple of chapters, and if you would please indulge me in this kind of prologue to the book of Daniel, because it'll help as we continue to navigate. And then after I do that, we're going to end with like one or two very specific applications for our lives. Because if I do this prologue and you don't capture like what I just said, which is Daniel immerses us in a prophetic identity that is intertwined with the human experience, then I failed miserably. So I'm sorry if I do that. So here's a few things to note. There are three major themes in the book of Daniel. The first is judgment, waiting, and war. Judgment, waiting, and war. Three themes. And in chapter 1, we see all three things happen. Right? And as we progress through the book of Daniel, we continue to see these sorts of themes: judgment, waiting, and war. The other thing that's really self-evident in the book when you begin to read it is that this is a book about the end. This is a book that is definitely not like Genesis, which is about the beginning. Right? It's not a book of chronicles in the sense that it's chronicling the history of several kings and historical periods in the Jewish story. But it is a book that is pivoting, looking at, and pointing us to the end. Which is interesting how it does it, because when you read the book of Daniel, you see how it begins and how it ends. And it begins with exile, and Daniel himself never sees liberation from his captivity, right? At the very end, Daniel dies a captive. But the story that Daniel is writing and sharing with us keeps pointing even beyond Daniel's lifetime. So it's a book about the end. How do we know this? Well, there's 32 biblical references in the Hebrew for a word called kesh, which means end. 14 of those come from the book of Daniel. So you look at, the 40-something books in the Old Testament that are written in the Hebrew, this word kesh, which means end, 32 times, and just over half of those, or just under half of those, happen in the book of Daniel. Daniel wants us to know that this is about the end. What's the other interesting thing? Well, in the book of Daniel, the book is written in two major languages. The beginning and the end are written in the book of Hebrew, and the center chapters 2 through 10, I think, or 2 through 7, are written in Aramaic. And in addition to that, not only are they written in Aramaic, there's also language there from Akkadian, from Persian, and even a little bit of Greek. Now, other than sounding super scholarly and making you feel like, yo, are we in a seminary class? Because that's definitely not my major. What I would say is, I'm sharing that because the book of Daniel isn't simply, by the inclusion of all these language, what Daniel is trying to tell us. The book of Daniel, which is about the end and has these themes of, judgment and waiting and war, isn't a book that's just for the Jews. It's a book that encompasses all of what is the known superpowers of the world at that time. The book of Daniel, when it speaks about the end, isn't speaking about the identity of a select group of people. It is speaking about the trajectory and the human experience of all of the known humanity at that time. So what's really important for us to know, and I think this is one of the key lessons that we can begin to derive from the book of Daniel, is that when we speak of Daniel, and when we speak about the end time, when we think about eschatology, we're not talking about the identity of just a small group. We're talking about the destiny, if you will, the journey of mankind. It encompasses and it impacts everyone. It's not just about us. The problem with that we face oftentimes, and whether you are any faith tradition that has a sort of centralizing figure or centralizing narrative, can often lean into that bent really, really hard, and what you begin to see is these sort of narcissistic understandings of God's interest in the world. So when Daniel breaks out and he says, yo, here's Hebrew, this is definitely my connection, and goes into the Akkadian and references the Persian and the Greek and all these other things, he's letting us know, listen, this is God is not just concerned with me. God is very concerned with all of the human experience. The prophetic identity isn't concerned with just me, but it is concerned with God's interest in all of humanity. Let's not forget that, folks. What's also very interesting about the book of Daniel, Daniel is really, really, really great, because Daniel, as you know, and maybe you will come to find out if you read through it, sure, it has a lot of prophecies, sure, it has a lot of dreams and painting and images and beasts and coded language, but it is a book steeped in prayer. Steeped in prayer. There's prayer happening almost the entire book. Almost every chapter has a prayer, and one chapter is almost entirely about a prayer, which says something about our prophetic identity, doesn't it? It's an invitation. Daniel says if we're going to be thinking about and looking into and addressing things about the end, what is a key characteristic and feature about what it means to live in this time? It means prayer is consequential. Prayer is important. And prayer informs how Daniel copes with all that is happening. Right? Daniel is seeing these visions and he's experiencing these pressures and sees all of this persecution, and there's threats on his life. And how does he cope? He copes with prayer. Oh, it's interesting. It's almost like God created us to be more than just our thoughts and minds. There's a relational connection to what Daniel is telling us about what it means to make it through this kind of time of the end. It's not just about what I know, but it's also about how I relate. Prayer is about relating to the divine. And almost consequently, not every single time, but in a lot of these prayer moments in the book of Daniel, not only does the prayer relate to him and the divine, but it also has a direct impact to him and his fellow humans. For the prophetic identity, relationships are tantamount. Relationships are significant. They are consequential. Now, here's the other really interesting nugget when we look at the book of Daniel as a whole. It's a book, yes, about judgment and waiting and war. It's a book that is very inclusive of the human experience, not just a singular identity. It's a book that really promotes spirituality, prayer, connection, relationship with God. But it's a book about feelings. You're saying to yourself, what? Feelings? Chap, are you serious? Yes, it's a book full about feelings. In fact, when I started leaning into this as I was working my way through the book and doing a glance at it and looking at Daniel chapter 1, I was just like, yo, how is it that there's so much feels in this book? How have I never seen all these feels in here? Did you ever think about Daniel and think to yourself, this book is about feelings? I bet you didn't, because I've never heard anybody preach about the feelings in Daniel. But they're all over the place. Can I show you a few? Yeah, Daniel chapter 2. The restlessness of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar sees something so insanely wild, he can't even remember it, but he wakes up in the sweats, and he's just like, yo, somebody tell me what I just dreamed. That's a lot of feeling Nebuchadnezzar has. Daniel chapter 3, we look at rage, right? Do you remember the golden image? And he gets really upset. He gets really upset with the three friends who didn't sit down. And the Bible literally says he was full of rage. Daniel chapter 4, we get into it. Nebuchadnezzar loses his mind. He feels and actually is kind of crazy. But it's not just about the feels of Nebuchadnezzar in this book. When we lean into and start to see the story of Daniel as he experiences some of the same things, Daniel chapter 7 tells us that he sees this vision and he's what? Troubled. He's troubled. Something inside of him is troubled and mystified by what's happening, and his spirit is moved. This guy is dealing with his feelings. And I think what's even more interesting is the contrast of Daniel chapter 9 and Daniel chapter 10. Would you mind if they want to put it up there? Daniel chapter 9, let's look at these two different experiences. Daniel chapter 9, verse 3. Sorry, my beard's messing with the mic there. Daniel chapter 9, verse 3, it says, "So I turned to the Lord and pleaded with him in prayer and petition, in fasting and in sackcloth and in ashes. I prayed to the Lord my God and I confessed." And there's a really long prayer. And skip down to verse 20, while I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people, Israel, and making my request to the Lord, my God, for his holy hill, while I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I'd seen in the early vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice. He instructed me and said to me, "Daniel, I have now come to give you insight and understanding. As soon as you began to pray, a word went out, which I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision." Daniel chapter 9, verse 3 tells us how Daniel was experiencing and seeing something and reading the scriptures, and he was so moved by what was there that he moved intentionally into prayer, into fasting, into petitioning, into confessions. By the way, all of these things are spiritual disciplines. And we get some insight into how Daniel is feeling based on how the angel responds when he arrives to Daniel. I would guess that Daniel might have been feeling a little bit of desperation. I'm guessing that Daniel might have been feeling a little bit abandoned. Why? Because one of the first things that Daniel says, as soon as your prayer went out, listen, as soon as you began to pray, a word went out and I was sent. I was moved. I was called to come. Daniel, don't worry, I am here. There's something for this moment for you. Daniel was in his feels. That's Daniel chapter 9, verse 3, but let's skip over to Daniel chapter 10 and let's see a different kind of Daniel. Verse 2, at that time, let's read verse 1 so you have the context. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who's called Belteshazzar. Its message was true and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. At that time, verse 2, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. Verse 3, I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3 weeks were over. Can you see the difference between 9:2 and 10:3? In 9:2, it tells us that Daniel moved very deliberately into fasting. In 10:3, it tells us that Daniel was overcome and overwhelmed into not eating, not sleeping, not doing any of those things. Some doctors would read this and say, man, I think Daniel was experiencing depression and anxiety. This book is about feelings. And why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't feelings be a part of the prophetic identity? Do you all think that you're going to move through your hardest times in life without having feels about it? Do you think that you're going to confront challenges and that the superhuman response in that moment is to not have the feelings that God gave you that are reacting to that stuff? Oh no, God makes it really clear. We have feelings to live with. We have feelings for the moment and the occasion, and our feelings are a part of who we are. The other really interesting thing that Daniel chapter 1 shows us, and here's what I love, and because it's the first thing, it's the thing that William talked about. Daniel chapter 1 tells us that equally important to the prophetic identity is our physical well-being. The body is a theme throughout the book of Daniel as well. In chapter 1, we note it because of the food that they're eating. In chapter 2, we hear Nebuchadnezzar's body responding to his feelings. In chapter 4, we see Nebuchadnezzar's body being affected by his prophetic reality coming true. His nails get long, his hair gets matted, all sorts of things. In Daniel chapter 5, Daniel chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den, we see that the threat to Daniel's body is a threat to his mortality. The body's a real thing. In fact, there's other references, if I remember Daniel chapter 11 or 12. Daniel eats a scroll and his body reacts. His stomach is like he's about to puke. You're saying to yourself, Chap, what are you trying to say with all this stuff? What I'm trying to say is that the prophetic work of a prophetic community has largely been incomplete. What do you mean? Now, this is the part in the message where if Kevin was here or Taylor was here, yo, Chap just made a huge leap. How did he get there? How do we get from all of this into saying that our prophetic identity and understanding is incomplete? Here's what I'm saying. The fact that we haven't grown up with tying all of these things as part of the prophetic identity suggests that our pioneers did a good work and we did not continue to carry it the rest of the way. That we would not continue to construct and understand the impact that being a people of the end, how it would affect us, and then how we could respond with humanity in mind. Right? One of the tragedies, not of Adventism, but of Christianity, has been our neglect for social well-being, our diminishing of people's physical calamities. And I mean, you saw this play out even just in the last 2 or 3 years. One of our ways to resolve viral issues, and this is not true of everyone, was pray your way out of it. And it's just kind of like, folks, seriously, I mean, fine, you don't have to agree that this thing is a pandemic and there could be, like, you don't have to agree. You could think whole thing is political, but do you also have to believe that the way to avoid the tragedy of a virus is to pray your way out of it? Oh, come on. But even how we deal with social pain, how culturally uncomfortable we are with the displays of sadness and depression and trauma, how uncomfortable we are with the worship expressions that involve body, right? I mean, there's so much that we have tried to contain and to suppress and to border in and to say, listen, when you are God's people, these things don't manifest. These things are, like there's a regimen here. There's a boundary. You can't do these things. So when I say it's incomplete, I'm saying that we need to continue to understand that if we have a prophetic identity and we believe that Daniel is about the end and it's about the human experience and God's intervention and placement and interaction with the human experience, we have to begin to understand. We have to begin to understand that it affects everyone in very different ways. I think about Daniel's friend. I remember the first time that I was introduced to someone smoking. There wasn't, this is really old school. We didn't have vapes. People had paper and tobacco, right? So this is pre-digital electronic, substance abuse. I remember running in with 2 other older gents, went into a bowling alley. Some of you may remember what that is as well. Went into a bowling alley, a pocket full of quarters, putting it into the cigarettes vending machine. I don't even know if those still exist. Like quickly because, underage, 14, 8th grade actually, putting it in, that person, like quickly, someone's watching the guard to make sure, grabbing this, and then putting that getting in the car, one of us was 16, going out into the woods, and these two guys just lighting up right in front of me, and me saying, yeah, I don't think I'm going to do that. I don't think, and I wish I could say it's because I thought it was unhealthy. I think it was more of like I was afraid I was going to get in trouble. And also it smelled terrible, so how could it taste good? But my response in that moment, the fear of disappointing my parents and the self-interest of this doesn't taste good, suggests that I had not developed in my prophetic identity the empathy to try to understand why someone would do what these guys were doing. Right? So let's just assume for a second that the reason his friend was vaping and my friends were smoking maybe was related to some sort of hurt or trauma that they had experienced before that. And this was their way of coping. If all that I see in that moment in that individual is a failure to be faithful to God, I miss the opportunity for God through me to be faithful to bring healing into their life. Do you hear what I'm saying? If our prophetic identity is resolved simply in how I interact and respond to the world around me and not how God intends to react and respond to the world that is happening, we really miss what the prophetic insight empowers us to do, which is to be a healing, rescuing, delivering presence in the world until Jesus comes. One of my favorite things about my church is that even though we sometimes have missed this in our deliberate teaching of prophetic material, and this is going to make some of you all feel uncomfortable, I am really thankful that around the world, there's two things that Adventists are known for: hospitals and schools. Isn't that interesting? Hospitals and schools. And one of the very different things about the schools that exist outside of North America is that you have Adventist teachers that have classrooms full of non-Christian or Adventist kids. And those teachers are excited. Why? Because they see an opportunity through the education that's happening to improve the community that they're living in. 20% of the kids on average, and this is, let me quantify my experience. This is mainly what I've experienced in Central America and South America and some Caribbean islands. You'll have 400 kids in a school, and maybe 50 of them are Adventist. But the teacher's frame and the parent's frame is, they're not. So here's how this would go in North America. In North America, this is how most people would respond. Sorry, I'm going on a tangent. That's okay. I still have 12 minutes. Yeah. So here's how we respond in Adventism in North America, mostly. What we would say, mostly, and I know because this is the things that I get to hear in my office all the time. What we would say mostly is, listen, I'm really concerned about the influence that these non-Adventist kids are going to have on my kids. Like, they're going to make them slip up, right? Like, that's not why we sent them there. The reason we sent them there is to keep all of that stuff out, right? So the general arc of Adventist education mindset here in North America is we have created these really great walls to keep things out of here so that our kids can have this sort of, other world experience, and sheltered from and kept away from all of that stuff. Now, take this and go to South America or Central America, which, by the way, this is going to drive some people a little bit crazy. This is and I've done this because I've built 4 schools in 4 different countries. The money was raised by Adventists through Maranatha, but the school system is funded by the government. Did you hear what I just said? Isn't that a trip? The school is funded by the government. The teachers are paid by the government. Okay? I'm just, but they get to teach their stuff. They get to teach their religious stuff. They get to interact. So their mentality is, and the pastor's mentality, every time I meet with the local pastor, the thing he's most excited about is how they have connected the stuff that's happening to the school to the ministry that they're doing with the church. Because they know that if they talk about abstinence from, those things that they're talking about abstinence from will have a direct impact in the positive well-being of that child and of the father. They celebrate the fact that they've been able to meet people who are alcoholics, workaholics, name all of the things that you want, and they're able to give them the tools and the ability to live a better life. So rather than seeing the school as a wall, they see the school as a bridge to connect with the human pain and need so that through the power of the gospel, they can improve that person's life. Isn't that amazing? The consequence of our privilege has been a creeping loss of our missional identity of how we ought to be interacting with the world. Okay, rant over. Sorry. Let's get focused back, and we'll wrap this up in 8 minutes. How about that? Yeah. So, prologue to Daniel. Yeah, it's about the end. It's a story, and the end not only affects us, it affects everyone. It is steeped in prayer and relational well-being, relationship with God, and the impact that it has with other people. When we look at Daniel, we understand that it is full of the feelings. We will go through this journey not as stoic, non-feeling people, but we have feelings to work through and to live with. Right? We have to learn how to manage and to navigate and address. It is clear in this prophetic identity that the things that we experience in the world impact our physical well-being. God did not intend to save this world by making us less human. He says, listen, the time of the end is coming, and yes, it's going to impact and affect the entire human experience. It's going to impact your mind, your body, your spirit, your community. And there is a way to navigate through this that brings me honor and glory and praise. So let's wrap it up about what Daniel 1 tells us and cues us into right away. Daniel chapter 1, as William talked to us about, shows us how these young people were leaving their country because they had lost in war. They were in exile. The book begins with conflict. The book begins with someone being displaced. The book begins with all of these people losing their known identity. So you have to remember that Jerusalem was the place that was promised to Israel. Do you remember that? They were in Egypt. God said, hey, I'm going to send you to another place. There's this place, it's called the Promised Land. And we're going to go to the Promised Land. And then that turned into building a sanctuary, which was the temple where God would be there with his people. And now these people have lost that land to Babylon, and Jerusalem is being destroyed over the time that they're there. And everything that they had as stakeholders in their identity was taken away. It was taken away. Daniel and all of his friends and all of the elite, because that's who it says here, this was among the best that were taken from Jerusalem, pretty much had lost everything about what it meant to be an elite part of the people of Israel. Defeated, lost, they were conquered. And they go on this long journey. They go on this long journey across the desert, being reminded every single day, like, I will probably never see Jerusalem, my place of peace anymore, the city of peace. I will never see it again. I think what's amazing is that Daniel persists. Daniel doesn't give up on his identity. Daniel doesn't give up on his calling. Daniel continues, and this is the really great part here. Daniel, let's go to Daniel 1. The king assigned from them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were trained for 3 years, and after that they were sent to the king's service. Verse 6, among those who were chosen were the sons from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Meshach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So there's two things that have happened very quickly here. The first thing two manifestations of one thing happening. It was the king's intention to assimilate the Jewish identity into the Babylonian identity. You know what I mean by assimilate? That they would get lost in the Babylonian identity, that they would understand that they came from some place, but now they're coming to a new place, a different place. And this new place, different place, was going to be who they were going to be, this new version of themselves. He did this in two different ways. The first way is, that we note here, that I'm noting, is he changed their names. He changed their names. And then the second thing is that it said that they put the king's table, it's the king's menu of meat and wine. Now, if you understand Jewish understanding of Torah and scriptures, did the Jews have any problem with eating meat? No. Do they have any problem with drinking alcohol? No. So what was it exactly that Daniel was standing against if meat and alcohol or meat and wine were not a problem for the Jew? What was it that he was standing against? I'm glad you asked. The text gives us some insight into what was meant here by meat and wine and the fact that it came from the king's table. You see, the king's goal was assimilation. He wanted to make it very clear that the people of Israel, these young people from Israel, were no longer subscribing to the ideas and identity and promises and hopes and prophecies and all of that stuff that was associated with being an Israelite. He wanted to make it clear that everything that would now happen was because of who he is, of who Nebuchadnezzar is, who he is as the king. So when it says that this was the select menu of meat and wine from King Nebuchadnezzar, this is another piece to begin to assimilate them, for them to begin to concede that, oh, wow, we belong to him. He is our provider. He is our sustainer. Now, you're thinking to yourself, wow, this is not that hard. This seems kind of obvious. Well, let's put it in a frame using a term that perhaps you're familiar with because it's a very good sociological term. Have you ever heard of the term trauma bonding? Right? And there's a few things that happen in trauma bonding that you can note, and for educational purposes, why don't I identify a few of those things for you? Here's some things that happen with trauma bonding. It's when there's an abuser and a survivor, when there's a dominant and subversive person. They try to do intimidation, right? It would be pretty intimidating if someone came and took me from my home, right? There's emotional abuse. Could you imagine the humiliation of having to traverse hundreds of thousands of miles? Yeah, and having gone from being a prince to now being ragged clothes and dirty and tired and sleeping on the ground. Isolation, being removed from your home, denial, minimization, and blaming. Could you imagine with every step that they were taking further and further away from their homeland, what the self-thoughts were that were happening there? Financial abuse and decision-making. The abuser makes it very clear that the important decisions are made by him or by her. The king knew that part of his warfare was not only to physically remove them, wasn't to only let them kind of go hungry and need, but now he knew that there was a mind game to play. He wanted to win their hearts and minds. So their association of all the trauma of that long journey was with the soldiers and the captains and the general. They arrive here at Babylon, and what's the first thing the king does? Is he shows them the kindness of giving them the best foods that he has available, his prescribed menu. And if you've been ragged in the desert for so long and you're suddenly in the king's court with the best foods, could you imagine the play on your mind? Well, maybe this king isn't so bad. Maybe, I mean, this is like, we had in our story, there was a wilderness experience. You remember Israel, 40 years in the wilderness. We didn't have great food. We just had this thing called manna and occasional food. I mean, we just went through a wilderness experience now. And now we're here in this table of amazing and comfort. And look at, this is the king. Maybe this is what God meant when he said he was going to establish us and we would be able to read. Maybe he intended for us to be a part of Babylon so that we could go and... Do you see what I'm saying here? Like just the slow buying in. King wasn't stupid, but neither was Daniel. But Daniel resolved, and there's another version that says, but Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself with royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. He says, now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king. This is interesting. This is someone who works in the king court, who's trying to show favor and kindness by putting this amazing banquet in front of these captives. He says, I'm afraid of my lord the king who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. This is interesting. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water, and then compare us. I love what Daniel has modeled here. Daniel purposed in his heart. Daniel had resolved in his heart not to defile himself with the king's food. What does this tell us? It tells us another really important thing about the book of Daniel. And I want to end on this point. One of the themes that you see in the book of Daniel over and over and over again is that Daniel models for us the importance of those of us who identify as part of a prophetic identity to seek to understand. Daniel, too, he doesn't just tell Nebuchadnezzar the dream or what it means. Daniel actually has to go back, pray about it, process it, and say, God, show me something that I haven't seen. God, show me something that I haven't seen, and then help me to understand the thing that I haven't seen already. Help me to understand. And we go, and vision after vision, Daniel takes a posture of seeking to understand that which has been revealed to him. Now, what we know from the rest of this chapter in Daniel chapter, towards the very end, it describes that God gave them great wisdom and understanding and knowledge. It tells us that, at the very end, 10 times that of the people around us. So how is it that someone who's really wise and really well-read and very intelligent and knowledgeable still has to continue to seek to understand things before making a judgment, before taking the next step, pausing to try to see and understand from God, what is all of this that's happening? That's what we see from Daniel. What do we see from the kings in the book of Daniel? Arrogance. Pride. They're determined and they're clear on their position in the world. And they are going to hold that position in the world no matter what. Doesn't matter how history unfolds. It doesn't matter what surfaces. It doesn't matter how it even impacts them. They are clear of their standing in history, and they are going to stay right there, which is in direct contrast to how Daniel behaves and presents the rest of the entire book. Daniel's presented with new information. Daniel's presented with new experiences and new visions. And Daniel's first response is to do what? Seek to understand what is happening. Not to assume that he already knows, right? Not to assume that his identity is fixed in everything that's already been revealed and understood. No. He sees it and he says, yo, God, help me to understand. Help me to understand. There's a humility that is necessary and has to be baked into the prophetic identity. That when new things happen, new experiences and new history and new context and new things that we haven't dealt with before or not in the same way, that our best and first response is to retreat into prayer and to try to seek to understand what it is that we're being shown. Daniel chapter 1 doesn't tell us that Daniel did this, but we can assume as we read the rest of the chapter that what Daniel did before he stood his ground and said, I will not defile myself, that he had spent that time looking at the landscape and asking God, how do I proceed right now? And he does it in two ways. He stands firm against the food and he says, this right here, this is a good spot. This makes sense. This is a key reminder. And here's what's really interesting, is that when he negotiates with the chief about the meal that they should have, he doesn't go with the meal that is allowed by the Levitical law. He goes back to the food that references who and what moment. Okay. Before the Torah, before Leviticus, where did we get our first prescriptions for diet? Where? Creation, Genesis chapter 1. What Daniel says right away is the king of Babylon wants me to see him as being my sustainer and my deliverer. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to remind him that my sustainer goes back to the creator God, the sovereign God in Genesis chapter 1. He doesn't go back to the Leviticus and say, actually what I need, king, is some kosher food. No. He says, I'm going to go back to that creation moment where God says, hey, of the fruit of the field, here, of this water, you can eat this. That's the creator's mark right there. So Daniel isn't just saying, what is the healthiest option? Daniel is saying, how can I send a message that, yeah, I'll be here, but I'm going to be here as the subject of the true king. The sovereign king, the creator king, the king who understands me, who sees me, and who really, truly sustains me. But before Daniel could pick that line, he retreated away to seek to understand who God was calling him to be in that moment. The other way that we see that Daniel is not just compliant or falling down a creeping compromise, and why would I say that? Here's why. Daniel read and understood all of the known wisdom and knowledge that was at that time. Did you get me? He read every book. He studied every math, science. It was the king. Babylon, he read all that stuff. He was super knowledgeable. Okay? But because he was clear on his mission and because he knew who he served, he could read that stuff. He could participate and he could understand it, and he could put on the garments of Babylon and understand he was not being defiled because he knew who God was and who God was calling him to be in that moment. Here's the other thing that Daniel did that was very interesting. Not only did he decide not to cede to the king something that could only be given to God, his creator, he was going to be a sort of quiet resistance. You see, they gave him new names. But if you look at these names and you see how they're spelled in the original language, Daniel changed their spelling. What? What do you mean change their spelling? Yeah, so all the names that they were given were the names that were associated with a particular Babylonian god. That's what they wanted him to do. They wanted him to assimilate into their religious, theological, cultural tradition. But what does Daniel do to sort of signal, yo, I'm not participating in this stuff? He changed the spelling of the name. It was quiet, it was subversive, it was intentional, but it was a clue to us. It was a clue to us. It's possible for us to live in a culture that is very confusing, that oppresses us, that seeks to have us deny our true identity as followers of God. It's possible for us to live in those circumstances and still serve the one true God. And still serve the one true God. There are two dangers that the Christian church in North America faces today. One is fueled by pride. We have an identity, we're clear on what that identity is, and this is how we're going to behave and insist that everybody behave just like us. Which sort of robs this whole notion of God is love and free will and free choice. One is pride. The second is fear. Fear that if we allow others to live by the truths that they know, even though we may know or understand them to be false, fear that somehow, if that happens, we won't survive. What Daniel propositions to us is that when you know the one true God and you understand him as your sustainer, as your deliverer, as the one that gives you hope, you best be humble, A, and B, if God is with you, you have nothing to be afraid of. If God is with you, every circumstance and challenge, you can be confident you will overcome. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the generosity of the clock today. And while I have some good friends who are saying, Jose, you could have done this shorter, they're probably right. But I ask that with what we've heard today, that we would seek to understand better who you're calling us to be right now. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You all have a good day. Happy Sabbath. We'll see you next week.